The staircase at Elmswood Lodge had 17 steps. Colonel Pettigrew had climbed them every night for 41 years, always pausing at the 9th to catch his breath. When they found him at the bottom on Tuesday morning, his reading spectacles were folded neatly in his breast pocket. A man does not fold his spectacles mid-fall. He had been wearing them when he left the drawing-room. Someone had taken the trouble to put them away. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. Tonight's case takes us to the village of Little Paddocks in the autumn of 1953, where a death arranged with exceptional tidiness asks us to notice what is missing rather than what remains. This is the death that was dressed as an accident. Little Paddocks in October was a village that seemed to breathe slowly. The hedgerows had gone copper at the edges, and the smoke from the bakery on the high street climbed in a thin grey rope toward a sky that could not decide upon rain. The church clock, which had been 3 minutes fast since the war, struck 9 as Mrs. Bantry crossed the green with her basket and a parcel of gossip she had not yet decided how to deliver. She was looking for Miss Marple. She found her, as she expected to, in the small back garden of the cottage on the lane, wearing the grey cardigan that had survived 2 grandsons and the winter of 1947. Miss Marple was bent over a row of late chrysanthemums, a pair of secateurs suspended in her hand, not quite cutting. She had the particular stillness of a woman who was listening to something other than the garden. "Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, rather breathless, "you will have heard." "About the Colonel," Miss Marple said, without turning. "Yes. Mrs. Hartnell stopped at the gate not 20 minutes ago. She had it from Dr. Haydock's housekeeper, who had it from the constable's wife. A fall, they are saying. On the staircase. At Elmswood Lodge. 17 steps. He went down the lot. Miss Marple straightened, at last, and looked toward the hedge as though something were pausing behind it. "The 9th step," she said softly. "He always rested on the 9th step. He told me so at the garden fete 2 summers ago, when he was kind enough to carry my chair. Well, he did not rest this time." "No," said Miss Marple, "he did not." They went inside, and Miss Marple set the kettle upon the hob, and the 2 women sat at the small kitchen table where so many things of consequence had been said over the years in voices that did not rise. Mrs. Bantry, who was not a woman given to preamble when she had news, delivered her news. Colonel Edmund Pettigrew, aged 74, a widower of some 9 years, and the proprietor of Elmswood Lodge, that rambling rose-clotted house at the end of Church Lane, had been found at the foot of his own main staircase at 7:15 on Tuesday morning by his housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. His neck had been broken. The doctor, summoned at once, had declared the matter consistent with a fall. The inspector from Much Benham, summoned after the doctor, had agreed. There was to be an inquest on Friday. The verdict, it was generally understood, would be accidental death. "And yet," said Mrs. Bantry, "you are pulling a face, Jane." "Am I?" "I had not meant to." Miss Marple poured the tea with great care. "It is only that I was thinking of the spectacles." "The spectacles? Dolly, when a man falls down 17 steps in the dark, what becomes of his reading spectacles?" Mrs. Bantry considered this. "Broken, I should imagine, or flung across the hall. Yes, one would imagine so." "And yet I am told," Mrs. Hartnell was most particular about the detail, she had it direct, "that the Colonel's spectacles were discovered folded, quite neatly, in the breast pocket of his dressing gown, not upon his face." not beside him on the carpet. Folded in his pocket. There was a small silence. Somewhere beyond the kitchen window, a blackbird made a single remark and thought better of it. He might have put them away before he came down, Mrs. Bantry offered. He might. But then one wonders why he was coming down the stairs at all, in the dark, without the spectacles he would have needed to see the stairs. Miss Marple stirred her tea, though she had not sugared it. The Colonel was extremely short-sighted. He once mistook the vicar for the postman at a distance of 4 feet. No, if he came down those stairs in the night, he came down with his spectacles on his face. And if his spectacles were in his pocket when he was found, then someone, at some point between the falling and the finding, took the trouble to fold them and put them there. Good heavens, Jane! Yes, said Miss Marple. It is rather. She set down her spoon. Through the window the copper hedge moved in a small wind, and the church clock, 3 minutes fast, struck the quarter. There is one other matter, Mrs. Bantry said, a little reluctantly. The front door. Mrs. Finch is quite certain she locked it the night before. When she came down this morning, it was still locked, from the inside. Ah, said Miss Marple, and she did not say anything else for some time. By the middle of Tuesday afternoon, the news had made its full circuit of little paddocks, and returned, somewhat embellished, to the places where it had begun. At the post office, Miss Weatherby had already constructed 3 separate theories, each more distressing than the last. At the Blue Boar, old Mr. Tibbs declared he had always said those stairs were a menace, which was untrue, since he had never said anything of the kind. At the vicarage, poor Mrs. Clement had burnt the lunch entirely, having stood at the window for 11 minutes, watching the constable's bicycle pass twice, in the same direction. Miss Marple, for her part, put on her good coat, took up her second-best umbrella, and went to call upon Mrs. Finch. Elmswood Lodge stood at the end of Church Lane, behind a low stone wall that had been intended 50 years ago to keep out sheep. The roses, untended since Mrs. Pettigrew's death, had grown into a dense and thorny shoulder along the southern face of the house. The front door was oak, painted a dark and sensible green, and bore a brass knocker in the shape of a fox. Miss Marple observed as she lifted it that the brass had been recently polished. Not that morning, perhaps, but within the week. Mrs. Finch answered the door in her second-best black. She had been crying, in the controlled way of women who have been servants all their lives, and know that grief, like everything else, must be put away when company calls. Miss Marple, that is kind of you. I wondered, my dear, whether you would prefer a little company. One does not always wish to sit alone in a house where Miss Marple let the sentence finish itself, which it did, obligingly. Mrs. Finch stood aside. The hall was long and rather dim, papered in a dark green that had been fashionable when the Colonel's mother had chosen it. The staircase rose along the left wall, 17 steps, as the village had by now memorized, turning once at a small half-landing with a window of coloured glass. Miss Marple glanced at it, and then at the polished floorboards at its foot, and then, for rather longer, at the small Persian rug that had been set straight against the bottom step. That is where he was found, Mrs. Finch said quietly. I have had the rug beaten. I could not. It did not seem. Of course not. Quite right, my dear. Miss Marple patted the woman's arm. Might we sit in the kitchen? Perhaps. Kitchens are so much kinder than drawing-rooms at a time like this. The kitchen was warm and faintly smelt of baking, though no baking had been done. Mrs. Finch made tea with the slow automatic competence of 40 years of service, and Miss Marple sat at the scrub table and let her talk. She had learnt long ago that the thing one wished to know was never the thing one asked for first. Mrs. Finch spoke of the Colonel, of his kindness to the gardener's boy, of his habit of reading until 11:30 and never a minute later, of the bell he rang in the mornings when he wished for his shaving water, and how she had laid the tray out as usual this morning before she had gone into the hall. 6:30 that would have been, she said. I came down to lay the fire in the breakfast room. The hall was quite dark still. I did not see him at first. I thought a coat had fallen from the stand. And the front door, my dear, you are certain it was locked? As certain as I am of my own name. I locked it myself at 10, the same as every night these 11 years. The bolt at the top, the key in the middle, the chain across. This morning the chain was still on. I had to take it off before the constable could come in. The back door? Bolted also. The kitchen door into the garden, I had the key in my apron pocket all night, as I always do. Mr. Pettigrew did not care for keys left in locks. A habit from India, he said. And the windows? Mrs. Finch hesitated. It was a very small hesitation, no more than the space of a drawn breath, but Miss Marple, who missed very little, caught it and put it aside for later. The windows were shut, Mrs. Finch said. I went round the downstairs rooms myself before the constable came. They were all shut and latched. All of them. All of them. Miss Marple nodded gently and sipped her tea, and did not remark upon the hesitation at all. They sat a little while in silence. Somewhere above them a board creaked, the house settling, or perhaps the constable, who was still upstairs, Mrs. Finch said, though Miss Marple had not asked. There is one thing, Mrs. Finch said at last, very low. I have not told the inspector. I did not think. It seemed so small. Yes, my dear, the spectacles. The Colonel's reading spectacles. When I found him, they were in his pocket, folded. She looked up, and for the first time her composure faltered. He could not see 3 feet without them. He would not have come down those stairs without them on his face. He would not. No, said Miss Marple softly, he would not. Outside, the church clock, still 3 minutes fast, struck the hour. Miss Marple did not leave Elmswood Lodge at once. She asked, with her particular diffidence, whether she might sit for a moment in the drawing-room. The air in the kitchen, she said, had grown close, and Mrs. Finch, glad to have a reason to be useful, showed her through. The drawing-room faced south. It was a long, rather gloomy chamber, panelled to the chair rail in a dark oak that swallowed what light the October afternoon offered. A fire had been laid in the grate, but not lit. The Colonel's chair, a wing-backed affair of tired red leather, stood close to the hearth, and beside it, upon a small walnut table, were the things a man sets down when he means to return to them in half an hour. A book, opened and face down. A glass, half emptied of what smelled faintly of brandy. A pipe, cold in its tray, and most curiously, 2 used coffee cups upon the small table by the window. Miss Marple noticed the cups. She did not remark upon them. Mrs. Finch, my dear, did the Colonel have a visitor last evening? Mrs. Finch, who had been plumping a cushion that did not need plumping, stopped. No, Miss Marple, no one came to the house. Not at all? Not at all. The Colonel took his supper at 7, as he always did, and I cleared at 7:45. He said he would read a while and then go up. He did not ring for anything further. I see. Miss Marple's eyes, mild and blue and very steady, moved from the cushion to the coffee cups and back again. And yet there are 2 cups. Mrs. Finch turned. She looked at the table by the window as though she had not seen it before. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she said, in a voice gone rather flat, I laid only 1 cup last night, for the Colonel after his supper. The second, I did not see the second. You cleared the supper things at 7:45. Yes. And the coffee? When did you bring the coffee? At 8:30 as usual. I left the tray upon that table there, the small table by his chair. 1 cup, 1 saucer, the little silver pot. I am quite certain. Of course you are, my dear. Miss Marple crossed to the window table with the unhurried step of a woman admiring the view, and looked down at the 2 cups without touching them. One stood upon a saucer, a thin brown ring in its bottom. The other sat beside the saucer, not upon it, placed, as it were, by a hand that had not quite known where such things belonged. A small spoon lay across the second cup. A little sugar had spilled upon the polished wood and had not been wiped. The Colonel took sugar in his coffee? Never, not these 20 years. He said it spoiled the taste. Ah, said Miss Marple. She returned to the hearth and stood with her hands folded, looking at the Colonel's chair and the book face down upon the table. The book, she observed without stooping, was a volume of Kipling. A ribbon marked a page near the middle. Beside it, upon the arm of the chair, lay the Colonel's reading spectacles case, open and empty. She did not point this out to Mrs. Finch either. She had a great respect for a woman's composure, and Mrs. Finch had already been tried enough for one morning. Instead she said, very gently, My dear, the front door. You told me the chain was still on this morning. It was. And the bolt at the top, and the key in the middle. Yes. Forgive an old woman her questions, but when a second person drinks coffee in this room, that second person must come into the house somehow, and must go out of it somehow. And if every door and window was fastened this morning from the inside, she let the sentence hang, as she had let the other hang at the doorstep, and watched Mrs. Finch's face. Mrs. Finch sat down rather suddenly upon the edge of a chair that was not meant for sitting upon. Her hands, which had been so steady with the teapot, were not steady now. There is a side door, she said at last, off the gun-room. It opens upon the yew-walk and the kitchen garden. The Colonel sometimes used it when he went out to smoke of an evening. I do not use it myself. I had forgotten to check it this morning. The constable did not ask. And last night I bolted it at 9, as I always do. But she stopped. Her mouth worked a moment. But the Colonel had the key. He kept it upon his watch-chain. If he had wished to let someone in, or to step out himself, he could have done so, and he could have bolted the door again behind them, if he had a mind to. Or they could have bolted it after him, said Miss Marple quietly, if they had the key. Mrs. Finch looked up. He was wearing the watch-chain when we found him. The key was upon it still. Yes, my dear, I do not doubt it. Miss Marple drew on her gloves. That is rather the difficulty, is it not? She took her leave a few minutes later, At the gate she paused and looked back at Elmswood Lodge, at its dark green door and its polished fox, and at the single upstairs window where a curtain had, she was almost certain, just that moment moved. The constable, perhaps, or perhaps not. The young man arrived on the 4:20 train, and by 5:30 all of Little Paddocks knew it. He had taken a taxi from the station, which was in itself remarkable, since the village omnibus ran perfectly well and cost 2pence. He had tipped the driver a florin, which was more remarkable still. He had asked the way to Elmswood Lodge as though he did not know it, though it was widely understood that he had stayed there as a boy. And when the taxi had set him down at the green gate, he had stood for rather a long time upon the pavement before he had gone in, as though, Mrs. Price Ridley reported over the hedge to Miss Hartnell, he were bracing himself for something. His name was Julian Pettigrew. He was the Colonel's only nephew, and, by all accounts of the will as it had stood these past 9 years, his only heir. Miss Marple learnt these particulars at tea-time from her own housekeeper, who had them from the butcher's boy, who had carried the taxi driver's account directly from the Blue Boar. By 6 o'clock she had added to them certain further particulars of her own, supplied by memory, that Julian Pettigrew was 28, that he had read law at Cambridge without distinguishing himself, that he had been sent down from a certain set of chambers in London 2 years ago for reasons never publicly specified, and that the Colonel at Christmas had written to the vicar's wife a letter in which the phrase grave disappointment had appeared twice. She turned these facts over in her mind as one turns over the pieces of a broken teacup, to see whether any of the edges fit. The next morning she was at the vicarage by 9, ostensibly to return a book on herbaceous borders, and by 9:15 she and Mrs. Clement were seated in the small sitting-room with the sun upon the carpet. "He came to see Leonard last night," Mrs. Clement said, "pouring. Quite late. 9:30, perhaps a little after. He wished to arrange about the funeral Friday, after the inquest. He was very composed, very proper." Was he, indeed? Leonard said afterwards that he had expected something different. A young man, you know, arriving to find his uncle dead. But Mr. Pettigrew was quite collected. He knew exactly what he wished. The hymns, the readings, even the flowers. "Even the flowers," Miss Marple repeated, in a voice that was not quite a question. White chrysanthemums. He was particular about that. He said his uncle had always liked chrysanthemums. Miss Marple took a small sip of her tea. The Colonel, she reflected, had disliked chrysanthemums with considerable feeling, had, in fact, refused to grow them in his own garden for 40 years, on the grounds that they were funereal and smelt of disappointment. She had heard him say so herself at the church fete, while standing not 4 feet from the stall where Mrs. Pettigrew, in her lifetime, had used to sell them for 6pence a bunch. But she did not mention this to Mrs. Clement. She put it upon the shelf in her mind, where she kept the coffee cups and the folded spectacles and the side door off the gun-room, and she went on drinking her tea. He is stopping at the lodge? Yes, Mrs. Finch has made up the blue bedroom for him. He said he would stay through the inquest, and perhaps a little longer. There are papers, he said, things to be seen to. Naturally. At 11 o'clock Miss Marple, having done her small round of calls, was walking home along Church Lane when she met the young man himself. He was coming out of the lodge gate with his coat collar turned up against a wind that was scarcely there, and he very nearly walked past her before he remembered his manners. "Miss Marple, is it not? I beg your pardon. I was thinking." "Of course you were, my dear. A most distressing business. I am very sorry." He was a tall young man, rather thin, with the colouring of his late aunt and something about the mouth that was entirely his own, a mouth that smiled too readily and rested, when it thought itself unobserved, in a harder line. His eyes were brown and a little red at the rims. He had not slept, she thought. Or had slept, and dreamed. You knew my uncle well, I believe. For a great many years he was always most kind. Yes, he was kind. The young man looked past her toward the church tower. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might ask. You were at the house yesterday, I am told, with Mrs. Finch. Did she seem quite herself to you? As herself as a woman may be, my dear, who has found her master at the foot of his own staircase?" "Yes, of course." He hesitated. Something crossed his face and was gone. "You did not, I mean to say, you did not notice anything out of the ordinary?" Miss Marple considered him a moment with her mild blue eyes. "Only that your uncle, my dear, had taken coffee with someone in the drawing-room before he died. 2 cups, you see, one with sugar. Did you know that he had had a visitor?" The young man did not answer at once. A muscle moved in his jaw. "No," he said. "No, I did not know that." He raised his hat, rather abruptly, and went on down the lane. Miss Marple stood a moment watching him go. Then she walked home, slowly, and did not speak to anyone at all until she was inside her own gate. The inquest was fixed for Friday at 11. On Wednesday evening it rained, a steady, patient October rain that made the gutters run and kept the village indoors, and Miss Marple sat by her own fire with a piece of knitting upon her lap, and did not, for the most part, knit. She was thinking about sugar. It was a small thing, the sugar, a very small thing. But Miss Marple had observed in some 67 years of watching her fellow creatures that people take their coffee in much the same way all their lives, and that the exceptions are almost always worth remarking. The Colonel had not taken sugar. Therefore the second cup with its spilled grains upon the walnut had been drunk by someone else, and that someone else had sat in the drawing-room of Elmswood Lodge on the evening of Monday last, and had drunk coffee with a man who, a few hours later, was dead at the foot of his own stairs. Who took sugar in little paddocks? A great many people. Dr. Haydock took 2 lumps. The vicar took 1. Miss Weatherby 3, and was rather defiant about. Mrs. Price Ridley took none, but had been heard to say she wished she could. And Julian Pettigrew, Miss Marple did not know yet how Julian Pettigrew took his coffee. It was a thing worth finding out. She was turning this over when there came a knock at the door, and Mrs. Finch stood upon the step, very wet, with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper held against her coat. "Mrs. Finch, come in, my dear. Do come in. You are drenched. I cannot stop, Miss Marple. Only, I had to bring this. I did not know what else to do with it." She sat, however, when pressed, and accepted tea, and did not open the parcel at once. She had the look of a woman who had carried something further than her strength allowed, and had now set it down. "It was in the grate," she said at last, "in the drawing-room. I was laying a fresh fire this afternoon. The constable said I might. The room had been looked over, and when I raked out the ashes, I found this. under the cold cinders. It had not caught properly. She unwrapped the parcel with hands that were not quite steady, and laid upon Miss Marple's table a half-sheet of notepaper, scorched down one side to a brown and crumbling edge, but otherwise legible. Miss Marple set her spectacles upon her nose and read. The paper was cream-coloured, of good quality, and bore no address. The writing was a man's, a firm, slightly backward-sloping hand. What remained of the letter read as follows: "Cannot continue as we have done. I have given you every chance, and more than every chance. If you will not come down on Monday and answer for yourself, then I must act as I have said I would act, and the consequences will fall where they must. I am an old man, Julian, but I am not yet a foolish one. Do not imagine." Here the bairn took the paper, and the sentence with it. Miss Marple read it through twice. Then she folded her hands upon the table and sat very still for some time. "Mrs. Finch, when was this letter written, do you suppose? I cannot say for certain. But the Colonel wrote at his desk on Sunday evening after church. I heard the blotter. He sealed an envelope and set it upon the hall table to go to the post. I took it down to the box myself on Monday morning, before breakfast. You are sure it was the same letter? I could not swear to it. But it was a letter addressed to Mr. Julian, in London. I saw the direction. I remember thinking the Colonel did not often write to his nephew, and that the letter was a thickish one. A thickish one. 2 sheets, I should say, perhaps 3. Miss Marple looked again at the half-sheet upon her table. A single page, then, had been sent to London, and here, upon this scorched fragment, was what appeared to be a second page, or a draft, or a duplicate, which had never left the house, and which had been, quite deliberately, pushed into a cold grate and imperfectly burned. By whom? Not by the Colonel. The Colonel had died in the hall, not in the drawing-room, and his hands, Mrs. Finch had observed, were quite clean. A man who burns a letter at a grate leaves traces upon his fingers. The Colonel had had none. Then by the visitor. The visitor who had drunk sugared coffee in the drawing-room, and who had, perhaps, come down from London on Monday afternoon by the 4:20 train, and gone up again by the last train at 10, except Miss Marple reminded herself that Julian Pettigrew had arrived in Little Paddocks on Tuesday. Everyone had seen him arrive. The taxi, the florin, the pavement, a young man arriving for the first time to a house he had not entered in years, unless, of course, he had arrived twice. Mrs. Finch, she said gently, the side door. Off the gun-room. On Monday evening, did you go into the gun-room at all? No, Miss Marple. The Colonel kept the gun-room locked. I had not been in it for a week, and on Tuesday morning, when you went round with the constable, was the gun-room door locked then? Mrs. Finch was silent for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, no, it was not. And I did not say so. I did not think. No, my dear, of course you did not. The rain outside went on falling. Thursday dawned clear and cold, with a mist lying low upon the water meadows, and the rooks quarrelling in the elms behind the rectory. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, dressed with her usual care, and before breakfast had written 2 small notes, one to Dr. Haydock, asking whether he might spare her a quarter of an hour at his convenience, and the other to Mrs. Bantry, in which she inquired with apparent idleness whether Dolly happened to recall the name of the young woman who had come down from London last spring to visit Julian Pettigrew at the Blue Boar. For Miss Marple remembered, and had remembered in the night, waking once at 3 and lying awake until 5, that there had been such a visit. It had not been much spoken of at the time. Julian had stopped in the village only a weekend, had dined once at Elmswood Lodge, and had quarrelled with his uncle, it was said, over some matter not made public. The young woman had not come to the lodge at all. She had taken a room at the Blue Boar, had walked upon the downs, and had returned to London on the Sunday evening train. Mrs. Price Ridley had described her as not quite the thing, which in Mrs. Price Ridley's vocabulary might mean anything from a brassy laugh to an unmarried condition. The reply from Mrs. Bantry came by 11 o'clock, brought over by her gardener's boy, Jane. Her name was Delia Strood. Tallish, dark, rather handsome in a hard way. She signed the book at the Blue Boar. I asked Joe Tibbs at the time, "Why do you wish to know, Dolly?" Miss Marple folded the note and set it beneath the tea-caddy. She was putting on her coat to walk down to the Blue Boar when she saw, through the parlour window, a figure at the vicarage gate across the lane. A woman. Tallish. Dark. She was standing under the like gate, as though she had taken shelter there, though the morning was dry, and she was looking up at the church tower with the expression of a person who had come a long way to see something, and was not sure now whether she wished to see it. Miss Marple did not go to the Blue Boar. She went instead to the church, by the side path through the yew walk, and arrived in the porch at the moment the woman was turning to leave. "Forgive me, my dear," she said, with the particular diffidence she reserved for strangers. "I could not help noticing you have come a little distance, I think. Are you looking for someone?" The woman turned. She was, as Mrs. Bantry had said, handsome in a hard way, 30 perhaps, with a wide mouth and eyes of a pale cold grey, and a coat of dark green that had been good some seasons ago, and was good still, though the cuffs were shiny. She looked at Miss Marple for a moment with a kind of suspicion, and then, evidently concluding that an elderly lady in a grey coat was not worth suspecting, her face eased a little. "I am looking for the churchyard," she said. "I understand Colonel Pettigrew is to be buried here tomorrow." "Yes, at 3 o'clock. Were you a friend of the Colonel's?" "No." The word came rather short. Then, more slowly, "No. I never met him. I came down because of Julian. I thought he should not be alone." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "you are a friend of Mr. Julian's. I am his wife." The churchyard was quiet about them. A blackbird went through the yew hedge with a sharp small clatter. Miss Marple, who had learned in a long life never to show astonishment, did not show any now, but she set the word away carefully, as she had set the sugar away, and the coffee cups, and the side door off the gun-room. "Forgive me. I had not understood. No one has. We were married in July, very quietly. Julian did not wish his uncle to know. The Colonel had views, about me, or about the idea of me. He had never met me either." A small bitter smile touched the wide mouth. "He had decided a good while ago that I was unsuitable. Julian thought to tell him in time. He kept putting it off. And then, on Monday, the letter came. The letter from the Colonel. Yes, you saw it. Julian showed it to me on Monday night. He had been very quiet all afternoon. The letter said—" She stopped. Her gloved hands closed upon the iron of the like gate. The letter said that unless Julian came down on Monday and gave an account of himself, the Colonel would alter his will. that he knew more than Julian supposed, that he had made inquiries. And did your husband come down on Monday? The woman looked at her very steadily. No, he was with me in London all Monday evening. We dined at 8 at a small restaurant in Soho. The proprietor knows us. We left at 10:15 and went home together. He did not leave the flat again until he took the morning train on Tuesday. I see, said Miss Marple. I thought you ought to know, the woman said, since you are asking about him in the village. People have told me you have been asking. People tell a great deal, my dear, in a village. Yes, they do. Delia Pettigrew now drew on her glove tighter. He did not kill his uncle, Miss Marple, whatever you may think. He did not come to this house on Monday night. I have not said that he did. No, said the younger woman, with a slow, dry smile that was not quite pleasant. You have not said anything at all. That is what troubles me. And she turned and walked away down the lane toward the Blue Boar, without looking back. Dr. Haydock received Miss Marple in his consulting room at 2:30 that afternoon. He was a large, loose-built man of 60-odd, with white hair that would not lie down, and eyebrows that did as they pleased, and he had known Miss Marple for the better part of 40 years. He did not, as a rule, stand upon ceremony with her. Well, Jane, you have come about the Colonel. I have come about the Colonel, Edward. I thought you would. Sit down. Will you have sherry? At this hour? Certainly not. I shall have sherry. It is my house. He poured himself a small glass and came round the desk and sat in the armchair opposite her, and for a moment he looked into the fire with the slight frown of a man turning over a professional difficulty in the privacy of his own drawing-room. The verdict at the inquest tomorrow, he said, will be accidental death. Yes, I had supposed so. It is what the facts will support. He fell. He broke his neck. There is no sign upon the body of any blow that was not consistent with the fall, no sign of poison, no sign of struggle. The hands are unmarked, the nails are clean. The heart for a man of his age was sound enough. He went down 17 steps in the dark, and he died at the bottom of them, and that is what I shall say upon oath tomorrow morning, and I shall say it with a clear conscience, because it is the truth. Of course, Edward. And yet, said Dr. Haydock, looking at the fire, yes? And yet, I am not entirely satisfied. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and waited. The time of death, said the doctor slowly. I was called at 7:15 on Tuesday morning. I was at Elmswood Lodge by 5 past. The body was cold, but not as cold as I should have expected had he died at 11 the previous night, which is what Mrs. Finch at first supposed, since the Colonel had gone up to bed, or was thought to have gone up to bed, shortly after 10. Rigour was fully established and beginning to pass off in the smaller muscles. Jane, I will not swear to it in court, one does not, with an elderly subject and an unheated hall, but if you ask me privately, as an old friend, I should say the man had been dead between 8 and 10 hours when I saw him. Not 12, not 15, 8 or 10. Which would place the death somewhere between 9 in the evening and 11 on Monday night. Not later. Not later. Not by my reckoning. But I shall not say so tomorrow, because I cannot prove it, and because the inspector has his accident and is contented with it, and because an old country doctor who cannot prove his opinion does well to keep it to himself. Miss Marple was silent for a little. There is something more, she said at last. It was not quite a question. There is something more. The spectacles. Ah! He was wearing them when he came downstairs. I am as sure of that as I am of anything in this business. The bridge of his nose showed the faint indentation a man's spectacles make when he has worn them for hours without taking them off. That mark fades in 20 minutes or so after the spectacles are removed. It had not faded. He had his spectacles upon his face within 20 minutes of his death. They were not upon his face when I saw him. They were in the breast pocket of his dressing gown, folded. Folded, Jane. Yes, a man does not fall 17 stairs and fold his spectacles on the way down. No, Edward, he does not. Someone took them off him after he was dead. Or dying. And put them away. Neatly. As a man puts away a thing he does not wish to see broken. The doctor drank off his sherry. I do not know why. I do not know who, but it was done, and I do not like it, and I am telling you because you are the one person in this village who will do something about it that does not involve writing letters to the chief constable. You are very kind, Edward. I am not kind. I am uneasy. He set down the empty glass. There is one other thing, and then I have done. The stomach contents, a light supper, taken some 4 or 5 hours before death. Mutton, a little bread, some stewed apple, all perfectly as one would expect. But also, and this is what has troubled me, coffee. A good deal of coffee. Drunk, I should say, within an hour of death. With sugar? Dr. Haydock looked at her with his white eyebrows gone up sharply. With sugar. A noticeable amount. Now how in the name of heaven did you know that? I did not know. I suspected. The Colonel did not take sugar, Edward. No more he did. I know that as well as you do. I was the man who persuaded him off it in 34. Then he drank a cup of coffee, within an hour of his death, that had been sweetened by somebody else, or that somebody else had prepared and handed to him. So it appears. They sat a moment without speaking. A coal fell in the grate. Edward, said Miss Marple quietly, I should be very grateful if you would say none of this tomorrow at the inquest. I had not meant to, Jane, and I should be even more grateful if you would tell me, privately, whether a man who has drunk a cup of coffee with a good deal of sugar in it would necessarily taste anything else that happened to be in it. The doctor looked at her a long moment. No, he said. He would not. The inquest was held in the back room of the Blue Boar, which on ordinary days served the village as a reading room, and on market days as a place where farmers could leave their wives while they did business elsewhere. The coroner, a thin-faced man from Much Benham, who wore pince-nez and spoke in the careful flat tones of a man who did not wish to be quoted in the local paper, took his place behind the deal table at a few minutes past 11. Miss Marple sat at the back, between Mrs. Bantry and Miss Weatherby. She wore her second-best coat and the grey hat, and she had the particular air of a woman who had come out of respect and would not dream of drawing attention to herself. She observed, however, with considerable attention, that Julian Pettigrew was seated in the front row beside his solicitor, and that Delia Pettigrew was not with him. She observed also that Mrs. Finch, giving her evidence in a black dress and a voice that shook only once, said nothing whatever about the side door off the gun-room, nor about the spectacles, nor about the 2 coffee cups upon the walnut table. She spoke of locking the house at 10. She spoke of coming down at 6:30 and finding her master at the foot of the stairs. She was not asked about anything else, and she did not volunteer. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence in 4 sentences. The deceased had died of a broken neck, consistent with a fall down the staircase. Death would have been instantaneous, or near enough. There was no sign of any other injury. He could not fix the time of death more precisely than between 9 on Monday evening and 6 on Tuesday morning. The coroner asked no further questions. The jury, which consisted of 7 men from the village who wished to be back at their work by luncheon, retired for 11 minutes and returned a verdict of accidental death. The coroner thanked them, expressed his sympathy to the relatives, and closed the proceedings. By 12:15 the room had emptied, and the trestles were being set up for the dinner trade. Miss Marple remained a moment in the doorway. Julian Pettigrew passed her on the way out, and she saw that his face was quite grey, and that his hand, as he drew on his glove, was trembling. He did not look at her. He turned left down the street toward the lodge, walking rather too fast for a man who had nothing to hurry for. "Well," said Mrs. Bantry at her elbow. "That is that, I suppose." "That," said Miss Marple, "is one thing. Whether it is that, I cannot yet say." She declined Mrs. Bantry's invitation to luncheon, pleading a small errand, and walked down the high street in the thin October sunshine toward the post office. She did not go in. She stood for a little at the window where the telegrams were sent, and read with apparent interest a notice offering a reward for a lost retriever, and waited. At 20 minutes to 1 the door opened, and Delia Pettigrew came out. She was in the same dark green coat, but she had added a hat, which she had not worn at the Light Gate, and gloves of a different pair. She had a yellow telegram form in her hand. She folded it, and put it into her handbag, and turned toward the Blue Boar. "Mrs. Pettigrew," said Miss Marple quietly, "a word, if I may." The younger woman stopped. For an instant Miss Marple saw, in the grey eyes, something that was not quite fear, and not quite calculation, and might have been both. "Miss Marple, I wonder whether you would walk a little way with me. Toward the church it is a pleasant path, and there are no ears in the hedges at this hour." Delia Pettigrew hesitated. Then she said, "Yes, very well." They walked in silence until they were past the last house. The lane turned between 2 high banks of hawthorn, already stripped by the wind, and the church tower stood grey and square above the bare branches. "My dear," said Miss Marple, "I owe you an apology. I spoke to you yesterday at the Lick Gate as though I suspected your husband of coming down to Little Paddock's on Monday night. I do not believe now that he did." Delia Pettigrew turned her head sharply. "You do not?" "No. I have had occasion since yesterday to learn certain things about the times of trains, and about the time at which the Colonel died, and about 1 or 2 other matters. I shall not trouble you with them. Only I do not believe your husband was in this village on Monday night. Then. But I believe, my dear, that someone was. Someone who knew the house. Someone who could come and go by the side door off the gun-room. Someone whom the Colonel was expecting, and was prepared to receive, and sat down with in the drawing-room over coffee." There was a long silence. The wind went through the hawthorn. "Miss Marple," said Delia Pettigrew at last, in quite a different voice, "why are you telling me this?" "Because, my dear, you sent a telegram just now from the post office, and because the young woman at the counter, who is my gardener's niece and has been, from her childhood, A person who cannot keep her own counsel will by tea time have told the village the address to which that telegram was sent. And I should be very sorry indeed if that address were one which it would embarrass you to have known. Delia Pettigrew stopped walking. She looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, and then, slowly, she put her gloved hand to her mouth. "Oh God," she said softly, and she began, quite silently, to cry. They sat down upon the low stone bench beneath the yew in the churchyard, the old bench that had been put there in memory of a curate who had died in '98, and upon which Miss Marple reflected a great many troubled things had been said in the course of half a century. Delia Pettigrew did not cry for long. She was not, Miss Marple perceived, a woman who permitted herself the luxury of tears. She dried her eyes with a small plain handkerchief, folded it and put it away, and when she spoke her voice was quite steady, though pitched rather low. "The telegram was to my brother. Yes, my dear. His name is Stephen Strood. He was at the lodge on Monday night." Miss Marple said nothing. The yew moved slightly above them. "He is not a bad man, Miss Marple. I want you to understand that. He is weak. He has always been weak. Our father was a clergyman in a small parish in Norfolk, and when he died there was very little left, and Stephen has never been able to manage money. He has been in trouble once or twice, not seriously, not criminal, but trouble. I understand. Julian knew him. They had been at Cambridge together briefly. That was how I met Julian, in fact, through Stephen. When the Colonel's letter came on Monday morning, Julian read it to me at breakfast. It frightened him very badly. He said the Colonel had evidently been making inquiries, and had learned something he could not put in a letter. Something about you, something about Stephen. That is what we thought. There had been a matter last year at a house in Hertfordshire where Stephen had stayed a weekend. Some jewellery had been missed. Nothing was ever proved, and Stephen swore to us both that he had had nothing to do with it. But the Colonel, you see, knew the people. He had been making inquiries through them. We were certain that was what the letter meant. If the Colonel named Stephen in any formal way, or spoke to his own solicitor, your brother would have been ruined. Ruined. And Julian with him, by association, and the marriage made public on the worst possible terms. So your brother, Miss Marple said gently, went down to Little Paddock's on Monday to see the Colonel and to ask him to hold his hand. Yes, Julian did not wish him to go. Julian said it would make matters worse, but Stephen said he would go and plead for himself, and that he could not bear to sit in London and wait for the thing to fall. He took the 3:40 from Paddington. He got down at Much Benham at a little after 5, and he walked across the fields. He has a map of the country. He knew the side door from a visit he had paid there with Julian years ago. As a boy, he did not go to the Blue Boar. He did not go anywhere that he would be seen. He came to the lodge by the yew walk, in the dusk, and he tapped at the side door, and the Colonel let him in. The Colonel was expecting him? No. That is the strange thing. The Colonel was surprised to see him. But he let him in. He took him to the drawing-room. He made coffee, rang for Mrs. Finch to bring the tray, and then sent her away, and they talked. What did they say? Delia looked at her hands. Stephen has told me only a little. He said the Colonel listened. that he was not unkind, that at the end the Colonel said he would think upon it overnight and give his answer in the morning by letter. Stephen left the house at a little before 10. He walked back across the fields. He slept at a small hotel near the station at Much Benham under another name. He took the first train up to London on Tuesday morning and arrived at our flat a little after 9, and that is when we heard from a telephone call Julian made to the lodge that the Colonel had been found dead at the foot of his stairs. "And you and your husband," said Miss Marple, "decided that your brother's visit must never be known." "Yes, God help us. We decided it in 20 minutes, over the breakfast table. We thought that if it came out that Stephen had been there on the last night of the Colonel's life over a matter of a scandal and a will, no one would believe in an accident. No one. And if it was not an accident, no one would believe in anyone else." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "My dear," she said, "I am going to ask you a question, and I wish you to answer it honestly. When your brother left the Colonel in the drawing-room at a little before 10, was the Colonel alive and well? Stephen says so. Did your brother clear the coffee cups? No. He said the cups were left upon the table. He let himself out by the side door and drew it to behind him. He could not bolt it from the outside. He supposed the Colonel would do that, or Mrs. Finch would find it in the morning. The side door was not bolted on Tuesday morning. Mrs. Finch has confirmed that. Then the Colonel did not bolt it, or could not." Delia Pettigrew's grey eyes went up quickly, and then away. I mean, my dear, that if your brother left by the side door at a little before 10, and if the Colonel died between 9 and 11, as Dr. John Haydock privately believes, then we have a very narrow hour indeed in which a man who took no sugar drank a cup of coffee that someone else had sweetened for him, and then fell 17 steps in the dark without his spectacles on his face. But Stephen, yes, my dear, that is the question. Was your brother the only visitor that evening, or was there perhaps another? Word count, Chapter 9, 1,000 words. Ready for Chapter 10 whenever you are. I'll write Chapter 10 as a strong penultimate chapter that tightens the net before the final reveal. It would be a shame to rush the ending when we've built this carefully over 9 chapters. You mentioned final, but we still have threads to close properly. The sugar, the spectacles, the second visitor, the funeral. Let me give you Chapter 10 now, and you can call for Chapter 11 the reveal, and Chapter 12 the oper after. They buried Colonel Pettigrew at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, in a fine thin rain that came sideways across the churchyard and turned the heaped earth at the graveside to the colour of wet iron. The village attended in force. The Colonel had not been universally beloved. He had been too exact a man for that. But he had been respected, and in little Paddock's respect filled a churchyard almost as well as affection. Julian Pettigrew stood at the head of the grave in a black overcoat that was a little too large for him. Delia Pettigrew stood 3 paces behind him under a black umbrella held by a stranger who was not introduced to anyone and who left before the service was over. Miss Marple, standing beside Mrs. Bantry, observed him carefully. He was a slight, sandy man of perhaps 25, with a weak mouth and an anxious manner, and he departed by the side gate at the first opportunity, walking fast and looking at no one. "Stephen Strood, I suppose," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "I imagine so. Jane, what will you do?" "I shall wait," said Miss Marple, "until tomorrow, and then I shall, I think, call upon Mrs. Finch again. You do not believe it was the brother. I believe the brother told his sister the truth." or most of it. It is a curious thing, Dolly, how often weak men tell the truth when stronger ones lie. They have not the nerve for invention. The service ended. The mourners moved away through the like gate in small damp groups, exchanging the subdued remarks that English people exchange upon such occasions. Miss Marple, declining an umbrella, lingered a moment at the edge of the path. It was there that the gardener's boy spoke to her. His name was Tom Perry. He was 14, and he had worked at Elmswood Lodge on Saturdays and after school for nearly 2 years. He was a thin, earnest child, with a look of being perpetually on the edge of some observation he did not know how to deliver. He took off his cap when he saw Miss Marple, and stood twisting it. "Miss Marple, ma'am." "Tom, how are you, my dear?" "Miss Ma'am, I've been wanting to speak. Only I didn't know as I ought." "Well, speak now, Tom." "We have a moment." He looked about him the way boys look about them when they have a thing to say and are not sure the world ought to hear. "It's about Monday, ma'am." "Monday afternoon. I was at the lodge. I stopped sometimes of a Monday to do the boiler. The colonel liked it stoked proper before the evening. I was in the scullery passage, ma'am, about 5:15, and I heard the colonel on the telephone in his study. The study door was open a crack." "Yes, Tom?" "He was cross, ma'am. He was speaking cross. He said, no, I will not have it tonight. I have another matter to attend to tonight, and you will come tomorrow morning as we arranged, and not an hour before." That was what he said. Word for word, ma'am. I remember, because he never was cross on the telephone, not ordinary. Did he say to whom he was speaking? "No, ma'am, but at the end he said, 'Very well. Good night to you,' and he put down the receiver hard. And then he stood a moment in the study. I could hear him, and then he said to himself, quite clear, 'The woman is a perfect fool.'" "The woman," said Miss Marple softly. "That was his word, ma'am." "You are a good boy, Tom. You have not told anyone else this?" "No, ma'am, only I was thinking, with the inquest and all. You were quite right to think, Tom. You will say nothing to anyone. Not to Mrs. Finch, not to the constable. You will come to my cottage tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and I shall give you tea and a shilling, and you will tell it all again to a gentleman who will be there. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." He went away through the rain, very upright, as though he had laid down a stone he had carried too long. Miss Marple stood a little while at the edge of the path. The rain was lightening. The last of the mourners had gone. She turned at length and walked home alone by the yew-walk, and she did not at any point upon the way greet anyone at all. That evening she wrote 3 letters at her small desk by the window. One was to Dr. Haydock, requesting that he call at her cottage at 4 o'clock on Saturday. One was to Julian Pettigrew at Elmswood Lodge, requesting the favour of a private interview at the same hour. And the third, the longest, was to the chief constable at Much Benham, a gentleman who some years ago had been obliged to admit, rather against his will, that Miss Marple's observations upon a matter in a neighbouring parish had proved to be both accurate and unanswerable. She sealed the 3 letters. She took her knitting into her lap. She did not for the most part knit. She was thinking now about a woman who had telephoned Elmswood Lodge on Monday afternoon, and had been told to come tomorrow, and had not waited till tomorrow. A woman who took sugar in her coffee. A woman who knew the house well enough to find the drawing-room in the dusk, and the stairs in the dark, and the breast-pocket of a dressing-gown, in which a pair of folded spectacles might, with great neatness, be stowed away. A woman, Miss Marple thought, who had been in little paddocks rather longer than most of the village had supposed. Outside, the church clock, 3 minutes fast, struck 7. They assembled at Elmswood Lodge at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. It was Julian Pettigrew who had, at Miss Marple's quiet request, asked them to come, though it was Miss Marple who had named the company. Dr. Haydock arrived first, with the chief constable from Much Benham, a spare man of 60 with a grey moustache and an attentive silence. Then Mrs. Finch, in her black dress, her hands folded against her apron. Then Delia Pettigrew, and, behind her, her brother Stephen Strood, who had been fetched from his lodging in the town by a quiet word, and who stood now at the back of the drawing-room as a man stands who does not know whether he is a guest or a prisoner. Tom Perry, the gardener's boy, sat upon a hard chair by the door, his cap upon his knee. And last of all, shown in by Mrs. Finch, with a face that betrayed nothing, came a woman in a neat brown coat, whose name until that afternoon had not once been mentioned in the course of this account. Her name was Miss Amelia Rivers, and she had been, these 4 years, the Colonel's secretary. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 40, with a firm, pleasant face and steady hands, and she lived in a small house at the farther end of the village, which she had taken on a long lease in '49. She came up to the lodge 3 mornings a week to deal with the Colonel's correspondence and his investments, and the village had, on the whole, liked her. She had a quiet manner and a good voice, and she took sugar, 2 lumps, in her coffee. Miss Marple was seated in a small chair near the hearth, her knitting in her lap. She did not rise when Miss Rivers came in. She only looked at her mildly and said, "Thank you for coming, my dear. Please do sit down." Miss Rivers sat. She looked first at Julian Pettigrew, and then at the chief constable, and last of all at Miss Marple, and in her pleasant face nothing altered at all. "I have been asked to come," she said evenly. "I do not know why." "No, my dear, I will tell you." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "On Monday afternoon, at 5:15, you telephoned the Colonel from the kiosk outside the post office. I have the exchange's record. The chief constable was good enough to obtain it this morning. You asked to come that evening. The Colonel told you not to come until Tuesday. He was, I am afraid, somewhat short with you. The gardener's boy, who was in the scullery passage, overheard the whole of it." Miss Rivers' eyes moved, very briefly, to Tom Perry. The boy looked steadily back. He did not speak. "You came notwithstanding," Miss Marple went on. "You came by the side door, which you had a key to, having used it for 4 years upon the Colonel's errands. You came at about 10:30. After Mr. Strood had left by the same door, you were watching the house, I think, from the yew walk, and you saw him go. You went into the drawing-room. The Colonel was still there. He had not yet gone up to bed. The coffee tray was upon the table, and a second cup. Mr. Strood had not drunk from it. You poured yourself coffee and sat down, and you told the Colonel what you had come to tell him." "Which was," said Miss Rivers, very quietly, "that you had been, these 4 years, taking small sums from his investment account, not large sums. The sums a careful woman takes who means never to be caught. That the Colonel, on Sunday evening, had been going through the half-year statements and had found a discrepancy. He had written 2 letters that night. one to his nephew, of which we have heard, and one, I believe, to his solicitor, asking that a full audit be put in hand on Tuesday morning. That was the appointment he told you to keep, Tuesday morning, with himself and, I do not doubt, his solicitor present.
The chief constable, who had been standing by the window, now moved a single pace forward. He did not speak. You could not permit Tuesday morning, Miss Marple said. So you came on Monday night. You sat with him, you drank coffee with him, and at some point in that conversation, I do not know at what point, you put into his cup a quantity of the chloral hydrate which, I am informed by Dr. Haydock, the colonel had in his medicine cabinet against his occasional sleeplessness, and of which you, as his secretary, knew both the existence and the place.
With 2 lumps of sugar in the cup, he would not have tasted it. This is, Miss Rivers began. A little while later, Miss Marple continued gently. He became drowsy. You suggested he go up to bed. You helped him to the foot of the stairs. Perhaps you went up with him a little way. At the 9th step, where he always paused, he was unsteady. You had only to assist him. 17 steps is a long fall for an old man who is not himself. The room was very still. Afterwards, you went back into the drawing room. You took the letter he had drafted to his solicitor, the duplicate, in his own hand, which he had left upon the blotter, and you put it into the grate and struck a match. It did not burn properly, as such papers so often do not. You washed your own coffee cup and set it back, though not quite where Mrs. Finch would have set it. You folded the colonel's spectacles which had come off in the fall, and you put them tidily into his breast pocket. Because you are a tidy woman, Miss Rivers, and because you could not bear to see them broken upon the floor, and because you did not understand that that one small act of tidiness was the thing that would hang you. Miss Rivers did not move. You went out by the side door. You did not bolt it, because you could not, and you walked home through the fields. The chief constable took another step forward. Miss Rivers looked, for a long moment, at the empty fireplace. Her hands, folded in her lap, were perfectly still. "The cup," she said at last, as though to no one. "I washed the wrong cup." "Yes, my dear," said Miss Marple. "You washed yours. You should have washed his.